Every Christian should realize that God, again, raises up nations to judge evil. And so that there is an appeal, especially for Christians, when we are persecuted, that we have an appeal to other righteous nations, or that even nations that God raises up to judge our nations may not be righteous. But the purpose of government is to punish evil and avenge good. What happens when governments begin to do the opposite? When they begin to punish good and further evil.
Which is what the United Nations has been doing.
Which is exactly what the United Nations.
80 years.
Yeah, you've just cataloged all of that, and so we need to stand opposed to that. We need to stand opposed to the idea that there can be a utopia created by man, and that we should turn over all of our sovereignty as nations to a one world government.
And welcome, friends, to the Generations broadcast. Kevin Swanson, your host, with you today. Bill Jack from Worldview Academy in studio with me. Adam McManus, our host on theworldview.com, is with us as well on this edition as we do some Worldview news and review on this segment. Adam, welcome. Good to have you here.
Great to be here.
And Bill, it's good to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for that.
I had to work with that for a second.
Yeah, you did. You had to come up with just the right wording for that.
Yeah, I was working on an
Bill,
adjective that
Bill,
worked.
You're here.
You're
here.
You're here. Okay. All right, my friends. Bill Jack, as well, Adam McManus, two of my best friends in the world, are with me on this edition of the program. And we like to cover some of the critical historical events, some of the most earth-shaking, world-changing events that are playing out right now in human history. And I've been committing myself to writing history for the last, I'm going to say, at least 10 years. I've probably written 5,000 pages of world history, American history, church history, ancient history. And I will say that every Christian family, every Christian student, every Christian young person should be reading history. I believe history is the most important subject. Why? Because the gospel is history. Jesus enters into history to save the world. And also the Bible is largely history. Therefore, Christians should be very interested in what's going on in history. Obviously, God's hand is in history, as well as we have some players. Humans are playing out some very significant events in history. God's hand is always behind it all. So God is sovereign over these things, and yet humans are engaged. And so the President of the United States is making history. And I suppose with his address to the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly just last week, this was highly significant. Adam, your comment on this?
Well, first of all, as Donald Trump is prone to do, he went way over time by 2/3. He just kept talking.
He went on and on.
Talking. Yeah. But this is, without a doubt, the most anti-United Nations president we have ever had. And with good reason. He understands the importance of American sovereignty and how these global institutions like the United Nations, like the World Bank, are compromising the sovereignty of the various nations that are members of them and are always championing anti-Christian, anti-conservative worldviews, pushing the homosexual agenda, pushing abortion, pushing contraception, pushing day-after pills, the abortion kill pill. The United Nations hates God, hates the Bible, hates everything that we take stock in as Christians. And he rightly challenged them to reject globalism. He said, we've got unchecked migration, illegals flowing into not just America, but all over the world. And the climate change activism was also something that he attacked frontally.
And I want to take some of these clips that we aired on the worldview.com because I think these are highly significant clips. It's, I think, wonderful that the President of the United States stands up and defends the Christian faith. The last major political figure that would do this was probably Winston Churchill. Now, Reagan, yes, to some extent, but not so aggressive, not standing in front of the United Nations at the 80th General Assembly and bringing out comments like this, defending free speech, free expression, protecting religious liberty. I mean, listen to the kinds of things he said.
Expression, let us protect religious liberty, including for the most persecuted religion on the planet today. It's called Christianity. And let us safeguard our sovereignty and cherish qualities that have made each of our nations so special, incredible, and extraordinary. In honor.
All right, so there it is. Let us defend Christianity, the most persecuted religion on the planet today. Somebody standing up and saying that. You know, it's interesting. There was it Bill Maher from HBO? Bill Maher, right, from HBO. And he said something like this. He said, the Nigerian Christians that are being slaughtered wholesale is probably the most ignored story by the mainstream media today, and it's egregious. And he said, and they're persecuting Christians. And I think he might have referred to Christianity as the most persecuted faith on earth today. And the President of the United States said the same thing, and I say kudos to him.
And Bill Maher, by the way, is a self-avowed atheist. He's written books about it. But he is a sane voice on a number of issues and takes direct attack on the college-age protesters out there who have been, frankly, brainwashed by their liberal college professors into thinking that somehow Hamas, the Muslim terrorist group, is on the right side of history by attacking Israel like they did in October several years ago. And Bill Maher pointedly said this past Friday on his HBO program, why aren't the kids, referring to the college kids, why aren't the kids protesting against the Muslim genocide in Nigeria against the Christians? That is a significant reason to lead a protest or a sit-in, and he's just confused by it. And frankly, his audience, which is in lockstep with much of what the college professors are teaching, we're kind of quiet and listening and hopefully being educated by Bill Maher, the atheist, no less, who took a stand for Christians.
Yeah, and getting back to the President of the United States address to the 80th General Assembly of the United Nations, here is another segment in which he comes off against globalism. He's taking the gloves off. He's pounding on globalism hard. Does this mean that he will push to get America out of the United Nations? I want to ask that question of Bill Jack in just a moment, but listen to what he says.
The globalist concept of asking successful industrialized nations to inflict pain on themselves and radically disrupt their entire societies must be rejected completely and totally, and it must be immediate. That's why in America I withdrew from the fake Paris Climate Accord, where, by the way, America was paying so much more than every country. Others weren't paying. China didn't have to pay until 2030. Russia was given an old standard that was easy to meet, a 1990 standard. But for the United States, we're supposed to pay like $1 trillion. And I said, this is another scam.
Okay. He's opposing the entire globalist concept where industrialized nations have to inflict pain upon themselves. And I think it's mainly an environmental agenda he's concerned with. But, Bill, is the President of the United States backing away from globalism, internationalism? Because there is this internationalism versus nationalism clash that's going on right now. And you know that I fall on the nationalism side of this, because we are going to say this later. We're going to say we oppose Babel. We oppose the idea of let us make a name for ourselves. Let us build a tower in a city that everybody will be all part of the same system. God dissolved that. He decentralized it, and he's not going to allow for an international agenda without Jesus Christ being King of Kings and Lord of Lords over it all.
Right.
So that's our position as Christians.
Yeah, it goes back to the purpose of government. Purpose of government is to punish evil and to encourage good. The purpose of government is to administer justice. Now, because governments are established by God, it's the institution established by God, but because they're run by men, governments tend to go corrupt. And so what happens is if you have a one world government, it will eventually go corrupt. And there will be no appeal by those who are being persecuted for righteousness' sake to other governments to step up. We see that God raises up nations to judge other nations. A very clear example of that was during World War II. Now, President Trump said, what is the purpose of the United Nations? It's not even coming close to living up to its potential. So he really criticized the United Nations, and those like you and I who have been very against the United Nations because we see it as a one world government, without Christ, and it will become corrupt. It is starting out corrupt. But he goes on to say later in a private meeting with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, quote, our country is behind the United Nations 100%. I may disagree with it sometimes, but I am so behind it because I think the potential for peace for this institution is so great.
So he's still committing himself to it.
Right. But I mean, he's throwing down the gauntlet. Mm-hmm. Now, the United States funds the United Nations. Let's not play any games. We are the ones who fund it.
We got the numbers here.
Yeah.
U.S. provides $18 billion to the United Nations, 28% of the full budget. Germany goes $8 billion, Japan $3 billion, UK $3 billion, and China $2 billion, while the United States is offering $18 billion for this monstrosity.
Let's cut that out.
Well, yeah, I think so. And the U.S., of course, only has 0.5% of influence.
Right.
28% of the UN budget, but holds only 0.5% of the influence for the General Assembly of the United Nations. Now, what Christians say is that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That is, we do not hold absolute faith in powerful governments because we know that the hearts of men need to be balanced out. And that balance of powers occurs by allowing for multiple nations to maintain their own compendium of power, such that we have a balance, that no particular organization, no particular government, no particular state maintains control over the whole shooting match. If you allow for a government, whether it be Germany or whether it be Russia or whether it be the United States or the United Nations, any kind of a state, any kind of organization that maintains absolute power over the entire world is a centralized form of power, much like what the conspirators were saying in Genesis 11. Come, let us build ourselves a city, a tower, whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the earth. And because this centralized power would have enabled them to do whatever they proposed to do, that was verse 6 of Genesis 11. This was the concern that God had. Once they were able to consolidate the power, God said, now they will be able to do, quote, whatever they propose to do. And there was no check to that power. And this is the concern that God had. Right. And if you have an international power, much like the Babel we see in Genesis 11, that has so much centralized power over all the nations of the earth, they will be able to do whatever they propose to do.
And righteous people will not have an appeal to a higher judge.
To anything else in the earth. Or there won't be any other nation that can take that international organization or governing power to task,
right,
because that international power subsumes all the nations of the earth. And this is the thing that must be resisted by Christians. Do you believe that, Bill?
Yes.
That this needs to be resisted by every pastor in America who's a Christian pastor?
This is a utopian myth. The idea of utopia is the idea of creating a perfect society. We can do that if we all just come together. And that is never happens. And the real
given that the hearts of all of these representatives of these governments that gather at the General Assembly, their hearts are not deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Like not one of them. Or let's just say we can get 62% of them. Their hearts are not deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Totally trustworthy.
No.
Are you buying that? Are you buying that?
If I were General Secretary.
Are you buying that?
If I were General Secretary of the UN, things would be perfect.
Exactly.
No. Me. How about me?
You?
How about me? Yeah. Put me as General Secretary of the UN.
I don't know.
I want to bring up a book that my friend wrote, Nathan Tabor out of North Carolina. He's a businessman, And it came out in 2006, but I think it's as relevant today as the day he wrote it. 332 pages in length, the hardback. I interviewed him years ago on my old talk show. The name of the book, I would recommend that people seek it out if they're interested in this particular topic, is The Beast on the East River, the United Nations Threat to America's Sovereignty and Security. And in it, he lays out that our sovereignty is under threat. He argues that the United Nations and other global institutions are undermining U.S. sovereignty, gradually shifting authority from national governments to international bodies. Secondly, there's a comprehensive agenda, liberal agenda, God-forsaken agenda across policy areas, from population control, taxation, environmental regulation, gun control, abortion, homosexuality, and thirdly, the United Nations is designed for supremacy, not just reform. They want to be in charge. They just don't want to suggest how nations might do things better. Nathan Tabor, my friend, the author, rejects the idea that the United Nations can be reformed and is an institution of reform. It needs to be basically shut down, as you have suggested, and defunded by the American government. I think if there's ever a time to defund the United Nations, it would be under Donald Trump's second term. So I don't know if there's a groundswell for this, but I sure would love to see it.
Well, we've got some senators and congressmen taking positions against and say basically get U.S. out. So there are some. But I want to take a break, and when we come back, a little more history on the United Nations with Kevin Swanson as well, Bill Jack, and Adam McManus next on Generations.
What happened to the church? We've traded courage for comfort, conviction for compromise, and what once stood strong now feels like jelly. A gelatinous, feel-good faith that demands nothing and offers even less. That's why Kevin Swanson wrote Strong. It's not a soft book. It's not a safe book. To anyone tired of the lukewarm, the flabby, the fake, this is a call to real strength. Strong grace. Strong gospel. Strong Savior. For those ready to stand firm and strengthen what remains. Grab your copy now at strongthebook.com. That's strongthebook.com. Not for the faint of heart, but for those who know it's time to be strong.
And we are back on Generations. Kevin Swanson, Bill Jack, as well as Adam McManus with me. And our American God's Providence course goes through this. I think our young people need to know very intimately what is involved in the development of this Babel, this modern United Nations. I can remember writing a poem. This would have been back when I was 18, 19 years of age, speaking of world government. And I had this line that I put in it. And just for one moment, they all come together, beginning a hell of a turn in the weather. Can you imagine me writing that when I'm 18 years of age? And effectively, friends, that's what happens.
You were in a very dark mood then, weren't you? Yeah. It was a dark time in your life.
It was a dark time in my life. But no, it was actually an insightful time in my life when I realized, you know what? This is not a good idea. This world government's not a good idea. What percentage of Christians do you think would agree with me? I'm kind of curious. What percentage of Christians would say, amen to that, Kevin?
That's a good
You're right.
question.
It is a risk. When man turns against God and develops an organization that opposes God at every single point and opposes Christ and attempts a world government, it just seems to me, most premillennialists, as well as postmillennialists, I mean, it doesn't matter eschatology. My guess is most Christians would say, that sounds kind of anti-Christy. That sounds like opposing Jesus and not acknowledging his rule over the whole world. That's evil. Wouldn't you agree that most Christians would probably agree with that?
Well, I'm skeptical.
Okay, you're skeptical on it. All right. Well, in American God's Providence, we actually trace this back to President Woodrow Wilson, the establishment of the League of Nations, or its attempt to do a League of Nations. He was burning with idealism and optimism for the future of the world. He was probably the worst president in the history of this country.
I would agree.
Yeah, he was into spiritism. He was into demonic stuff. He pretty much destroyed Princeton University, took all the Bible classes out, and then went on and became the most socialist, communist president we had had to that point, and also brought in a fair amount of eugenics and racism, as well as advocating a one world government. And again, he wanted a future that was not based on the rule of Jesus Christ. And he said, man has it within himself to make the world safe for democracy. America was the clear winner in the war, and the world was looking to Woodrow Wilson for leadership at the peace talks in Paris. And Woodrow Wilson presented his vision for the League of Nations. And again, friends, this is a big problem. The League of Nations, the United Nations, would never define justice by God's laws. And we know this. The centralization of power, as I said, would counter the will of God. Within the hearts of powerful men like Woodrow Wilson, we find this impulse to centralize power over the world through the use of international governments. Now, again, these are extremely risky. Now, President Wilson pushed this very, very hard, and it actually became the means by which he was broken. In fact, he was campaigning for the League of Nations all across the United States, came to Pueblo, Colorado, just south of us, and he fell apart, wept in front of the crowds, pleading for the League of Nations as the only hope for world peace. And that night, his body collapsed under physical exhaustion, and he never recovered. Eventually, his wife actually had to play for him as he completed his term as President of the United States. World nations eventually met in San Francisco, in California. In June of 1945, they agreed on a United Nations Charter. So after World War II, they finally came together, and some say the purposes of World War I, World War II, in the minds of some of the leaders, was to establish the League of Nations, or rather the United Nations. This was a big thing in the mind of Woodrow Wilson and FDR as well, and Truman. So now they established the Charter for the United Nations, and the United Nations is a purely humanistic document representing man alone, resting on man alone, and providing for man alone. It was godless. No reference to God at all. The documents plainly testified to faith in man. There's a quote here. Faith in fundamental human rights and man-made laws. The preamble to the Charter also promised to save mankind from war and untold sorrow. This was to be accomplished by the determination of man himself. No reference to the Prince of Peace, no reference to stated submission to the Lord of Lords. Rather, the United Nations Charter promised to provide social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom by man, for man. Alger Hiss was the first Secretary General of the UN. Alger Hiss, as you know, was a communist spy. He was convicted of communist, and he never repented of it. He actually was a committed communist to the end of his life. Alger Hiss was the major impetus behind the establishment of the United Nations and became the first Secretary General of the UN, and of course spent 5 years of his life in a federal prison. Alger Hiss was raised by a family that read the Bible regularly, etc., but he turned away from the faith and became a devoted Communist Party member in 1933, and the rest, of course, is history. So the United Nations thus far has funded abortion, abortifacient, birth control, et cetera, et cetera. At points, there's been a little resistance to the UN programs. In 2017, the Trump administration withheld $32.5 million from the United Nations Population Control Fund. By the way, you can get all of this from our textbook, America and God's Providence. Be sure your children understand the history of the United Nations. And the United Nations Population Control Fund has produced hundreds of millions of dollars for contraceptive distribution, birth control programs. Abortion entered the picture in the 1980s as the UNFPA funds reproductive health services in countries where, quote unquote, abortion is legal. And then the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child appeared in 1990. The UNICEF organization also big on the LGBTQ agenda. through its rights-respecting schools and inclusion resources, quote unquote, UNICEF has pushed a culture of LGBT and uses the Convention of the Rights of the Child as the basis for getting the LGBTQ agenda into nations all over the world. In fact, I was invited to the Bahamas National Education Organization because the UNICEF was pressing LGBTQ agenda upon these nations that are receiving federal funds and UNICEF funds. And they wanted me to come in, step in and say, what do we do? What is a biblical view of LGBTQ? What is a biblical view of applying a biblical worldview into the field of education? So I had like a 2 or 3 hour presentation for the entire board or the entire staff of the education organization or education department of the Bahamas, the nation of the Bahamas. Because all of these nations are getting pressed by UNICEF to incorporate this extremely liberal Western colonialism agenda that promotes LGBTQ into all of these nations, whether it be in South America, Central America, or Africa, or anywhere else in the world. In curriculum and education sector planning, UNICEF encourages gender-responsive teaching, that is transgenderism, and as well, the UN has been pretty much ineffective at everything else it does. And this is the thing that I was curious about. Has the UN does anything positive? Well, it turns out that murderous regimes have been actually strengthened in the Congo, in Lebanon, and Cambodia when the Blue Helmets arrive. The UN's arrival in Cambodia, I was concerned about that. I was thinking, well, Cambodia is probably one of the most significant events in UN history. Okay, so the UN enters Cambodia to try to fix the problem in Cambodia. After the killing fields and all of this, they finally arrive in 1993. And so the UN arrives in Cambodia, and I was checking this out. What is the BBC? The BBC has an article on how everything went. I'm like, okay, how did it work? When the Blue Helmets finally arrive in Cambodia, probably the proudest moment in UN history. Well, the BBC reports on this. This, again, isn't a conservative magazine. This is the BBC. The BBC reported on the UN in Cambodia. Quote, thousands of women enter the sex trade due to the arrival of UN personnel. And HIV/AIDS infections spiked.
They exploited the population.
So apparently, once they arrived, it actually was a boost to the economy in the sex trade.
Terrible.
Among the prostitutes of Cambodia. The UN then in Cambodia pushed an election, after which the losing party was in power, but the party that lost rejected the results. Like it was a 90% to 10%. Well, the losing party in power after the election said, well, we reject the results. And they strong-armed their way back into a coalition government using the pretext of a secessionist movement in the east of the country. And the UN buckled and admitted total failure in Cambodia.
And that was supposed to be their big
Go
success.
UN. Go UN. Yeah. I mean, wow. Yay, yay, yay to the big UN and all of the, $70 billion a year budget times 50 years of this. So after $2 trillion of money poured down the rat hole of the United Nations, this is what we get? In the 1996 UN study, The Impact of Armed Conflict on Children, the former First Lady of Mozambique concluded this. Okay, so she was involved in putting this study together, and the UN actually funded this. So how did they do? How are they doing in Africa as the Blue Helmets make it into the African nations? So they did a study, the 1996 UN study on the impact of armed conflict. This is the conclusion. In 6 out of 12 country studies on sexual exploitation of children in situations of armed conflict, prepared for the present report, the arrival of peacekeeping troops has been associated with a rapid rise in child prostitution. So, I mean, this is the grotesque stuff that's involved once the Blue Helmets arrive.
So we're just getting Genghis Khan and issuing Blue Helmets and letting them run amok.
Among the kids.
Yes.
Right.
Terrible, terrible stuff happening. To think that the UN is a blessing to the world, friends, that is a lie from the devil. That's a lie from hell. In 2016, a UN report named 21 countries that had 69 credible reports of child abuse incidents. One briefing note obtained by the Star claim that unique structural factors within the UN system made harder their goals of greater transparency and enforcement. Although military personnel are covered by military codes of conduct and justice systems, UN police and civilian staff accused of sexual exploitation and abuse in the field may face only minor disciplinary measures, such as repatriation and being banned from further future deployments, the unclassified document reads. Okay, now we can go on and on and on. Gun rights, the UN Arms Trade Treaty, which occurred, I think, about 10 or 15 years ago. Article 2 of the UN Armed Trades Treaty actually bans the civilian's right to own, buy, sell, trade, or transfer virtually all forms of armed resistance, including handguns. Article 3 prohibits access to ammunition. So if we were to sign the UN Arms Trade Treaty, Article 2 and 3 forbid the ownership of guns and ammunition. Article 5 of the UN Arms Trade Treaty requires nations to establish and maintain a national control system, including a national control list of who owns what conventional armaments. How would you like that? The International Criminal Court, as part of the UN. What do? Well, they've prosecuted mainly Africans to this point. One guy was held for 8 years in custody by the International Criminal Court up in The Hague before he was finally acquitted. So imagine this. Imagine the kind of freedoms that you enjoy under the International Criminal Court. Basically, they call it a star chamber deal, where no due process, indefinite detention without trial. They won't prosecute their own scoundrel friends, but just scoundrels who aren't on their team. And then they put them in hold for 6 or 8 or 9 years, and then they finally acquit them. The World Trade Organization also has mandated boycotts and embargoes on U.S. goods. The World Trade Organization was responsible for developing China into a superpower. The WTO gave China a shield against unilateral trade restrictions. Disputes had to go through the WTO processes, which meant countries like the U.S. could not simply raise tariffs arbitrarily without risking WTO violations. So the World Trade Organization, the IMF, are working hard to establish a single world currency, a single world central bank, a single set of world standards for trade, tariffs, and banking regulations. To which Senator Mike Lee this year, Senator Mike Lee has something of a resolution to get us out of the UN. And he said the UN has devolved into a platform of tyrants and a venue to attack America and her allies. We should stop paying for it. And Representative Chip Roy, I think from Texas.
From San Antonio, my congressman.
San Antonio, Texas, right. Chip Roy said the UN and its bodies do not advance the interests of the American people. So that's it, my friends. What do you think? I'm trying to give a record of what is it, 80 years? We're at the 80th General Assembly, so it must be 80 years. Not good.
No. And I'll tell you something. This October 31st on Halloween, I know most Christians don't have anything to do with it. Some Christians will perhaps give out a candy bar with an evangelistic tract, but for years, for decades really, UNICEF has had these orange and black boxes that the parents will order, and the kids not only ask for candy in their basket, but they will ask for coins in the UNICEF trick-or-treat box. And it took a temporary hiatus during the COVID-19 pandemic and was just online. But now the orange and black boxes of the UNICEF folks are back, also available through Hallmark stores and others. And they are essentially saying, well, give your dimes, your quarters, your pennies to the UNICEF trick-or-treat box because it will help children with nutrition, safe water, education, emergency relief. And what we want you to know today on Generations Radio is that with the dime or quarter or penny that you or others might give to that UNICEF trick-or-treat box might actually fund an abortion or might fund these blue-helmeted pedophiles going in as predators into a given country where they're exploiting children and they're supposed to be bringing peace to the country.
How significant is this issue? Bill, I want you to jump in on this for just a moment. The New American, the John Birch Society, fringe groups, premillennial groups, minor groups, minority groups across America might consider the United Nations and one world government as a dangerous prospect. I do too. I think it's dangerous.
Every Christian should. Every Christian should realize that God, again, raises up nations to judge evil. And so that there is an appeal, especially for Christians. when we are persecuted, that we have an appeal to other righteous nations, or that even nations that God raises up to judge our nations may not be righteous. But the purpose of government is to punish evil and avenge good. What happens when governments begin to do the opposite? When they begin to punish good and further evil.
Which is what the United Nations has been doing.
Which is exactly
for
what the United Nations
80 years.
Yeah, you've just cataloged all of that. And so we need to stand opposed to that. We need to stand opposed to the idea that there can be a utopia created by man, and that we should turn over all of our sovereignty as nations to a one-world government, because we recognize that utopia literally means no place. There is no utopia. There is no perfect world until Christ returns. It is not within man's capability, because the heart of man is desperately sick and wicked. And so we don't appeal to man. We appeal to God, who is the sovereign judge of the universe, to right wrongs, to wipe away every tear, to correct, and to administer justice. Now, he has established governments for that purpose, but we stand opposed to a one-world government. We stand opposed to a one-world economy. We stand opposed to a one-world religion, which seeks to bring about a one-world Messiah. And we all know where that comes.
Christ.
Without Christ.
Without Christ. Just for one moment, they all come together, beginning a hell of a turn in the weather.
Every utopia creates a dystopia.
Yeah. Adam, your thoughts on this? So, what's your opinion? I mean, is this a big issue? Is this significant? Should this be at the top of the list for your average conservative Christian senator out there?
Well, I think that a practical action step for Generations Radio listeners is to consider making two phone calls to both of their senators from their state at 202-224-3121. That's 202-224-3121. And if you're new to politics and you don't even know who your senator is, just tell them what state you're calling from, and the operator will help you figure it out. They'll route your call. And simply ask for the legislative aid that deals with the United Nations, and say, please consider defunding the United Nations. I don't think that this is a wise use of my hard-earned tax dollars, and I don't think we should give them another dime.
Yeah. Okay. All right, friends, you heard it on the Generations broadcast. Anybody want to interact on the issue, please email us at mail@generations.org. And you've been listening to the Generations broadcast with Bill Jack from Worldview Academy, Adam McManus from theworldview.com, all on this segment of the Generations broadcast. Please join us again next time as we continue to lay down a vision for the next generation. This has been a production of the Generations Media Network. For more information, go to generations.org/media.